Welcome back, I'm Rachel, and in this video I'm going to go over the structure of the C1 atlas vertebra. The C1 vertebra, also known as the atlas bone, is the first cervical vertebra. It is located in the neck at the top of the spine. If we look more closely at the vertebral column, we can see here highlighted in red that it is the first of all the vertebrae. If we now look even closer at just the cervical vertebrae, we can see here highlighted in red that it is the first of the cervical vertebrae. Now we're going to look at the different landmarks and features of this bone. Here we have the anterior view, the right lateral view, the superior view, and the inferior view of this bone. The first region of this bone is the anterior arch, which is the anterior part of this bone. The anterior surface of this arch is convex in shape. The center of this surface has a tubercle. The posterior surface of this arch is concave in shape. It has a circular facet for articulation with the dens of the C2 axis vertebra. The next region of this bone is the posterior arch, which is the posterior part of this bone. A groove is found on the superior surface of this arch for the vertebral artery. At the apex of the posterior arch is a tubercle known as the posterior tubercle. Next up are the two lateral masses, which are located between the anterior arch and the posterior arch on each side of this bone. The superior surface of the lateral masses have kidney-shaped facets on them known as the superior articular facets. These are for articulation with the occipital bone. The inferior surface of the lateral masses have circular-shaped facets on them known as the inferior articular facets. These are for articulation with the C2 axis vertebra. On the medial surface of each of the lateral masses is a tubercle for attachment of the transverse ligament. The next regions of this bone are the transverse processes located lateral to each of the lateral masses. They extend laterally and inferiorly from the lateral masses on each side of the bone. The transverse processes in this bone are longer than those found in the typical cervical vertebrae C3 to C6. The transverse processes consist of an anterior root and a posterior root that merge laterally, forming what is known as the foramen transversarium. The end, also known as the apex, of each transverse process is broad as the anterior and posterior tubercles are fused into one tubercle. In the center of the bone, an opening is formed known as the vertebral foramen. The transverse ligament runs between the tubercles on the medial surfaces of the lateral masses, dividing the vertebral foramen into two compartments. The smaller anterior compartment is occupied by the dens of the C2 axis vertebra. The larger posterior compartment is occupied by the spinal cord and the membranes covering the spinal cord. Now we're going to take a closer look at the bones the C1 atlas vertebra articulates with. This bone articulates with two other bones. The first of these articulations is with the occipital bone superiorly. The superior articular facets on the atlas bone articulate with the occipital condyles on the occipital bone. This articulation forms the atlanto-occipital joint. The second articulation is with the C2 axis vertebra inferiorly. The inferior articular facets on the atlas vertebra articulate with the superior articular facets of the axis vertebra. In addition, the posterior surface of the anterior arch of the atlas vertebra articulates with the anterior surface of the dens of the axis vertebra. The anterior surface of the transverse ligament articulates with the posterior surface of the dens of the axis vertebra. This articulation forms the atlanto-axial joint. What about the muscles that attach to this bone? Many muscles attach to this bone. The longest colli muscle inserts onto the tubercle of the anterior arch of this bone. The rectus capitis anterior muscle originates from the anterior surface of the lateral mass of this bone. The rectus capitis posterior minor muscle originates from the tubercle on the posterior arch of this bone. The rectus capitis lateralis muscle originates from the superior surface of the transverse process of this bone. The obliquus capitis superior muscle originates from the transverse process of this bone. The obliquus capitis inferior muscle inserts onto the transverse process of this bone. A slip of the levator scapulae muscle originates from the transverse process of this bone. A slip of the splenius cervicus muscle inserts onto the transverse process of this bone. And finally, a slip of the scalenus medius muscle originates from the transverse process of this bone. And that concludes this video on the structure of the C1 atlas vertebra. I hope you found it helpful.
Thank you for watching. If you want to support this channel, please subscribe and check out more of my videos.